Good evening, everybody. Hi, hello, and welcome to another session of Gather to Grow here on Food from Zanzi's Twitter Spaces. It is an absolute pleasure to be back. My name is Dawn Numdu. I'm your host for these sessions. I'm here once a week on a Wednesday, and we're basically here to gather and grow together. I think it's such an amazing platform to connect with farmers, agriculturalists, people within the agricultural industry from all over the world. Thank you so much to everyone who has joined me from very different parts of the country. It was so funny listening to the comments and reading all the comments from my participants or my speakers, at least, saying where they are, how they're struggling to find a good network spot. So without any more talking from my side, I'm going to ask my speakers just to introduce themselves, tell us a bit about who they are, what they do within the agricultural space, and of course, our topic this evening is specifically on enhancing agriculture and focusing on the valuable contributions of ecosystems. So I'm going to start with Ashley. Ashley, welcome to Gather to Grow, and thank you so much for agreeing to join me tonight and be a speaker on the session.
Good evening, Dawn and everyone else. Thank you so much for this opportunity. It's such a privilege to be able to speak on this platform. My name is Ashley. I'm 22 years old and I grew up in Johannesburg, only recently moving to Hoedspruit in 2021. I was very new to the conservation space and I was so lucky to be surrounded by incredible conservationists I could learn from, and that blossomed my love for conservation and wildlife. I am very new to the whole agricultural topic, but it's been incredible to be able to learn about this topic and hopefully I can add some value to it.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. And you're a camera operator and social media manager for Painted.tv, right? Just wanted to get your title
Yes,
there.
I believe I forgot that part. Yes, we're a live virtual safari and conservation business. So it's very incredible to be able to live in the bush every single day and practically use what I'm learning from the Southern African Wildlife College with my surroundings. So it's an incredible job and incredible company and co-workers. So I'm very grateful.
Thank you so much for being here, Ashley, and for sharing your skills and your experience and more of your, day-to-day life with us. It's a real pleasure to have you here with me. And then my next guest is Yapi Potgieter. Yapi is a walking trail safari guide by trade and a conservationist at heart. Thank you so much for joining me, Yapi. It's such a pleasure. Maybe more about you and maybe more about the work that you guys do.
Good evening, Dawn. Good evening, everybody else. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I am in the safari industry or the ecotourism industry. I've been a trails guide and working in the industry for the last 7 years almost. So I've been very, very privileged to actually be working with people and seeing the benefits of certain practices around conservation areas, which agriculture actually forms a big one of. And having farmed for a little bit in the past myself, I've only just recently started to realize the real value in agriculture and all the exciting development that's happening and how it can contribute to conservation.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's so interesting to speak to people that are in the industry, but not usually when you talk about agriculturists, you either think that they're like a hands-on farmer on the ground, they somehow on the agro processing side of it. But I mean, the work that you guys do is directly connected to agriculture. And so it's so great to have you both speak from that angle and join us for this conversation. I have two more guests, Dr. Kunisan Kwabe, who is one of my favorite people within the agricultural space, and have you do almost like our introductory comments just to set the scene for us and more on this topic, and just give us some broad perspective of this specific talking point when we talk about enhancing agriculture. What do we actually mean? And when we talk about understanding these valuable contributions of these ecosystems, and I want to get more into that later, but maybe just as a start, and then also just tell us who you are for those that might not know you. I'm sure for the Food from Zanzi, readers, they've seen you on our website, they've heard you on our podcast, you've contributed on webinars on indigenous crops and your farming and all of your research. But just to tell us about who you are as a start. Thanks.
Good evening to everyone who is with us here. The name is Qinisani Kwabe. I'm here representing the Southern African Wildlife College where I am currently working. But as you've just mentioned, I am an indigenous food specialist. Well, I don't like isolating it, an inclusive food systems specialist, but my focus area is mainly on indigenous food crops. I've been in the academic space, but equally so, I have been very much involved on the practical side of farming, where I've been producing and commercializing indigenous foods. Some of those would be the likes of your taro, what we call amadumbe here in South Africa, sweet potatoes, bambara groundnuts, etc. So, as we have this conversation, I think those are going to come up because they form an important part of the ecosystem services that we are talking about right now. And I'm very confident that Mr. Potgieter and Miss Ashley are going to be talking about the value of these indigenous crops, not just indigenous food crops, but even the ones that we don't consume, that we find out there in the wild.
Thank you so much. And again, it's always, great to have you join us and share your insights. We do have one other guest. I hope that she can still join us. She is actually from the Makalali Private Game Lodge. She's there as a nature guide. Motati Marilula is another guest that's supposed to be joining us this evening. I do hope she's able to connect. If not, we'd definitely be able to invite her to another conversation, perhaps incorporating some of these points and having a follow-up talk in the future. So just as a start, I mean, if we, very simply ask ourselves the question, what is an ecosystem? What are the key components? Maybe, Yapi, if you want to take us through that, and then actually your comments as well on the specific question. Thanks.
So an ecosystem, it is a system with a lot of different components that function within a certain geographical area. And those components would include both the biotic, the living parts of the system, which would be things from as small as some nematodes within the soil and the water, all the way up to things as large as the elephant and the trees in the area. And then it will also include all the abiotic or the non-living components, which would be things such as the rock itself that form the soils, the sunlight within the area, the environment, the climatic factors. And then it refers to the interaction of all of these different components and how the abiotic components affect the biotic components. And then also it refers to the small systems and interactions between the actual organisms or the living part of the system as well. They rely on each other, and it's a system that is very much affected by a very, very small scale of change. And removing one part of the system can unknowingly affect something on a much larger level within the system.
Thank you so much for that. Ashley, anything that you'd like to add to it? I think that was a very sound and holistic, response to it. But maybe you can just touch on my next question. How do these ecosystems functions and sort of what are the key factors that we talk about when we, consider agricultural practice and farmers, especially for new and developing farmers, because, a lot of what our conversations are about on these pages is to kind of share this kind of information with new farmers that's just entering the sector. Thank you so much, Ashley.
One of the main points that Yapi mentioned was the interconnectedness between all the components of an ecosystem. And I sort of see our ecosystem as a complete circle. And if you lose one link of your circle or one part of your circle, then your circle can't be completed anymore. So I think it's very important to take that into consideration when we are trying to conserve our ecosystems and gain the benefits from them. We need to make sure that we are focusing on every individual component so that they are able to support each other. So ecosystems function through different natural processes such as your different cycles as in photosynthesis, your natural disturbances, reproduction, as well as our exchange of energy and nutrients, which goes from our microorganisms to our producers and consumers and decomposers. So it just shows you how important every single link of your system is.
As both of you are speaking, I'm realizing, that an hour is probably not enough to go through all of these points and share all of the information that's probably out there for people to understand and know. But I'm hoping to kind of, grasp at some of the very important aspects, and that would be some of even the examples of ecosystem services or even contributions that support, for example, soil health and fertility, because that's a big aspect for farmers that they consider. They do tests, they try and find ways to improve their soil health and fertility when it comes to agricultural systems. What advice do you have around that?
So I was going to mention, and I completely forgot, but the importance of maintaining all our components are intact is that with healthy ecosystems, they will provide us beneficial services, which is, as you said, our ecosystem services. And if I can give a basic definition of an ecosystem service, it's any positive benefits that wildlife and ecosystems can provide to people. As you're talking about soil fertility and soil health, there are so many of our ecosystem services that naturally provide healthy soil. And that will include things like your erosion control, your decomposition, water purification, soil formation, nutrient cycling, pollination. They all are natural services that come from our ecosystems.
Thanks so much, Ashley. Any points that you'd like to share to that, Happy?
So within those ecosystems, there's often like smaller systems contained, like for instance, within the soil, being the very surface that agriculture takes place on is there's smaller things like nutrient cycling, things like different cycles like our water cycle, our carbon cycle. And all of these things need to be maintained in order to have the larger system that contributes to the nutrients within the soil be function at an optimal manner. If we change something small, like for instance, if we put too much fertilizer within the soil, we don't actually realize how that might affect the levels of certain chemicals within the soil. And in a long-term process, that might affect the yield of what might be produced from certain soils. Because of that, ecosystem services are very, very important. For instance, the food that's produced by plants, that eventually more plant communities we have in the area, the more pollinators we have, all of the services that they provide will eventually contribute to the nutrients that will be available in the soil at a later stage. Where if you just have one crop, for instance, you might actually affect the nutrients over a long term. It brings about less other biodiversity that might contribute to maintaining healthy soils.
A lot of what you guys are mentioning, I'm just recalling so many of the other conversations that we've had, things around intercropping, the usage of cover crops and what that does. We've had many of these conversations. It's almost like comes in together very nicely in this entire picture that you're painting for us in terms of our ecosystems and how that works. And so it's really great to kind of get that bigger picture from the points that you guys are making. And Yapi, I think you mentioned a very specific thing around pollinators, and I want to bring that into the conversation. What about the role of pollinators within agricultural ecosystems? And maybe you can focus more on their contribution to enhancing overall agricultural production. This is top of mind for some farmers and some agriculturists, but not for everyone. And if you could share some advice around the work that you guys are doing for these new and developing farmers, what would that be? Also for commercial producers, let's not overlook them. They are in the room, they do listen. And so maybe just to incorporate that as well. Thanks.
That's a really good question because I'm not an expert on all levels of this, but I do understand how all of these work together. And for instance, you mentioning multi-cropping. So multi-cropping, for instance, would bring about a whole different bunch of host plants, which will bring a whole different bunch of pollinators together. And pollinators actually contribute directly to the crop yield as they are the physical organisms that actually take the pollen grains from the male to the female part, and that way they fertilize the crops. And multi-cropping is one of the ways that you can bring about more of that. It also provides more and different types of products that can be produced. So in a way, this is often something that I know with the smaller scale farmers, which in my experience are often the type of farming that takes place around rural areas, around protected areas or game reserves. It's essential, I feel, that people need to be educated into, instead of putting all their produce into one or all their efforts into one type of crop, they can multi-crop, and that way have different products for different of the year, but they need to be educated. So what I found often from an ecotourism point of view, a lot of the lodges have programs running that they do have either donations coming in or people that directly come to help and fund certain projects that runs within the immediate communities around protected areas. And those projects are often aimed at teaching people, like for instance, how to herd cattle in a way that it might benefit the land, but also in a way that you don't find a lot of wildlife human conflict, which is often a big problem in some of these areas. So from my own experience is that basically educational programs getting funded through tourism is the way to help the local farmers or the smaller farming community to benefit directly from this. On a larger scale, I do know that it needs to be managed, and there's obviously an open communication channel and also support from larger farming practices to the smaller farming practices around that will definitely help, especially certain areas like, say, the Limpopo, for instance, where there's a lot of water getting drawn from the river, which is an essential lifeline, not only to the farmers that farm along it, but also to the greater wildlife spaces that is found on the verge of the Limpopo. Those things like communication and working together with the smaller farmers as well as the conservation areas is extremely important. And the only way that that can truly happen is through an open platform for dialogue as well as education. People need to work narrowly together on this topic.
Thank you so much. And it's so interesting again to think about how both of my speakers tonight are not directly in the agricultural space, but there's so much happening within this whole sphere that is so interconnected. And I think it definitely speaks to the topic itself. Thank you so much. I'm learning so much. My next question is also around pest management and disease control and how that interlinks with ecosystems and all of these services that you guys are talking about. And how does one kind of look at it in terms of that? And what are the aspects that farmers should understand? Please share some of those points. Ashley, Yapi.
I'd like to bring these two questions sort of together with the role of the pollinators as well as the diverse plant communities. But so pollinators, as Yapi said, they are essential they fertilize our crops directly, and they also aid in cross-pollination of our crops. And that's essentially going to increase the genetic diversity of our crops, which is going to increase the resilience, which will make them stronger and more able to deal with environmental changes and pests and diseases. Not only is it important to have an increased population of pollinators for your crops, but it also aids in the wild or native plant species surrounding your agricultural areas. And this can be sure because it creates habitat and food sources for your natural enemies of your pests as well. So your pollinators are also making suitable homes for other organisms that can aid in the decrease of pests, and therefore hopefully we can rely less on synthetic pesticides and just increasing the diversity of the creatures around our areas would be so beneficial.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I'd maybe like to get towards the end if there's time about, how does one realistically do this? I mean, it's not just the responsibility of people who are perhaps in your line of work or farmers. I think even for myself as someone who gardens in my backyard, what do I plant to sort of encourage pollinators to increase or visit my backyard? I mean, there's many things that we can all do collectively, I think. Dr. Kunisani, you wanted to mention something? I see you grabbed the mic.
One thing that is true is that I am sitting here as somebody who is a specialist in the food systems, and Ashley and Yapi are more on the conservation side of things. And I think you would remember a while back when we had a conversation, one of the things that we spoke about was how there isn't harmony between what we in the food systems do and what people on the conservation side actually do. There is no integration. So perhaps what Ashley and Yapi can enlighten us on, being in the conservation spaces and dealing with local communities there, is to indicate to us how we have altered our ecosystems, our natural environments, Are we leading to a decline of species in those spaces? I mean, I'm sitting here right now in Underberg and it's very, very cold, and everybody is harvesting firewood, but I don't see anybody replanting what they are getting from the natural forests. So perhaps they could sort of give us an indication of what we are doing wrong. And we see this mainly in the farming space. Farmers are known to be the ones who are leading to the deterioration of our natural environments. So, what have we done wrong? What has been their observations is what would be more interesting to me as somebody who would like to change habits within the food systems.
Thank you so much for that contribution, observations, and comments to our other speakers. Whoever unmutes their mic first can run with it.
I don't know how much I have to say on this topic, so maybe Yapi can pick it up for me afterwards. But I think the main thing is education, and a lot of things we have discussed within our lectures is trying to find value for our ecological services. And it's very difficult to put a price on something that happens in the background. And I think if we come to a point where we're able to educate people on the value of the ecosystem services and tell them that they don't need to be using these unsustainable methods that might cause degradation, then that might lead to a more sustainable way forward that can benefit not only agriculture, but also our wildlife areas. Yapi, I don't know if you can add on a bit to that.
No, for sure, Ashley. Thanks for that, because I was wondering when you'd bring that up. I think we as a species definitely, like, if there's one thing we can say, and I think that nobody can disagree with it, is that we drastically change our habitat with increased technology and the growing demand for food, especially, and especially from an agricultural point of view. The more people, the more mouths to feed. And we realize this, we can see by the decline in our natural systems. For instance, well, conservation, like anything else, is it gets made up as we go along. And it's funny how I find, even though from an agricultural point of view, like Dr. Kwabi said, agriculturist or farming practices in the past have contributed to a lot of the decline of natural habitat. But I think also from a conservation side, it's a lack of understanding of the interrelationship between conservation and agriculture, where at one point it was more of an idea of preserving that which is there and just keeping that and keeping everything else out, even any ideas as to how to manage an area like that. If we take, for instance, an example like wetlands, for instance, I know that wetlands, often you find that there's inland wetlands outside of naturally protected areas, but they still play vital roles in terms of species diversity. Inland water birds, plant species, fish communities, for instance, genetic diversity for those certain species of fishes. And I think there was at one point such a point from a conservation point of view, you looked at these areas and you just like kind of put it out, like it can't be preserved because it needs to go for agricultural things, but rather than to open up a line of communication where you can draw from both the agricultural side as well as the conservation side and kind of find a way as to manage and identify what's important within those areas and then manage it to a point where it will still sustain a diversity. And I think in that regard, both sides can learn from each other. I know that in the past, for instance, if I can take an example, the Makuleke wetlands, which is one of South Africa's Ramsar wetlands and a massive biodiversity area of importance. In the past, and I think one of the criteria for it being a Ramsar wetland is that the resources there be used sustainably. And what I found interesting is that the peoples used to utilize the resources they had in that area, but they did so naturally. For instance, they didn't fish all the pans at the same time, only certain times of years. The area had such diversity that they could use different occurrences, natural occurrences, like, for instance, the outbreak of Mopani worms, the certain time of the year, the nesting of the quillias, different types of things, and not just focus on one area and depleting one resource at any given time. like there's a real need for communication between the two sectors and not just each going its own way, if that makes sense.
Maybe just to add there, if you can still hear me, Don. So Yapi and Ashley talk about two critical things here. Yapi mentioned sustainability, and Ashley speaks about the raising of awareness. I want to start with Yapi. The term in itself, sustainability, is a very controversial term, even though it is not perceived that way. And the reason why I say this is because if I put this within the farming context, you get different players in the industry who would claim that they are farming sustainably. But when you look deep into their practices, I'll make an example with a friend of mine who is in KZN, a cane farmer. He doesn't cultivate his land. He doesn't cultivate the land. He doesn't use fertilizer, urea, which is mainly used in sugarcane farming, because he believes that it destroys the environment. But equally so, the same person who claims to be a sustainable farmer is the very same person who burns sugarcane before it is harvested. There's a reason why farmers do that. But also, if you look deep into that, the microorganisms in the soil are highly affected. And when I couldn't hear properly, I heard, I think it was Yapi was talking about soil matters. There are microorganisms that exist in the soil that enrich our soils so that we are able to produce what we eat, any form of vegetation for that matter. So by burning, you are contributing to the decline of microorganisms in the soil. That's number one. It's a subjective matter, but I'm not saying we should stop talking about sustainability. But what is important is what they both mention on the issue of raising awareness, talking to farmers about the importance of really taking this concept and practicing that which falls within the category of sustainability. Because at the end of the day, these services that we are talking about are the ones that are keeping us alive. We are eating food because of our natural environments. We are drinking water because of our natural environments. We talk about energy. It is because of what has been given to us by nature. And if we fail to take care of that, then we are doomed for disaster going forward. But I must confess that it's not only farmers that must be educated about this. If you look at people in communities, suburban townships, rural areas, everybody must be in the know and everybody has to play their part. But people aren't going to do that until we get champions that are going to go out there and start talking about these matters, educating our people. That would be a first start. I'm glad that Food from Mzansi has taken this up. It is a form of raising awareness. I'm hoping that the conversation isn't going to end here, but is going to be continued as you guys have more of these sessions.
I think there's lots of value in it, and that's always what we hope to bring to these types of conversations that we have on this platform specifically. And of course, this is a start to many conversations that we can plan around this topic.
And I think you're completely right. It's all about raising awareness and education. And once we are able to learn and teach people how to utilize and maximize the benefits from our ecosystem services, then we are going to be able to hopefully produce higher yields sustainably with fewer negative environmental impacts or social impacts and fewer external inputs. So I think it's very important that the word gets out there. And again, very grateful that we have this platform that we can share even the tiny bit of knowledge that we have.
Thanks so much, Ashley. Yeah, I just wanted to also just thank everyone for being here. We are nearing the end of our conversation. I think there were a few extra points that I wanted to, highlight or share, but I think we've basically covered it, most of these aspects. I think what we can do is maybe just get some last comments from our speakers, and then maybe just some practical, tips or advice that you can share. Where does one go about to read more, to understand this topic better? Of course, this conversation will be written up in an article that will be published on Food from Zanzi. So if you want more information on that, that's where you can get it.
Sorry.
And of course, you can also go back and listen to it on Food from Zanzi's YouTube channel. We go through some of the important aspects that you'd like to highlight and ways that you see us working more closely together in the agricultural, space, within the conservation space, and where we can realistically and how we can realistically do that. Because I think so many of these conversations happen with the same people in the same groups in the same way. But how do we start thinking differently about it? How do we get school kids to start thinking about it? My son is 5 years old. How does he understand it as a toddler, for example?
I'll start. I'm going to be jokeful about this one. Ashley is going to write us a book, and Yapi is going to give us a full article on the subject matter. So your son will have some comic book to read about ecosystem services, Don.
I totally love that. That's so awesome.
No, but on the real, I am committing that we will be sending an article to Food from Zanzi. Both Yapi and Ashley are going to take part in this because I think they've made some valid points, which I believe can be summed up beautifully for your readers and also for the nation at large so that they are clued up about the importance of these ecosystem services, particularly provisioning services. I'm not sure if they mentioned those earlier. That's what we're going to dwell on when we work on the article.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Kabe. Yapi, would you like to share your final comments, just also your last thoughts around the topic? Something that you'd like to leave farmers with from your perspective as a conservationist, and more around where we can access more of the research information around, can I say, best practice, if that's something that we can kind of refer to it as. What would you say? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kwabe. I agree with all of that. It's such a broad topic. There's so many examples. One of my main thoughts on this topic always is actually, and just from this conversation now, is realizing how important that need for communication between the different fields and the different experts on different levels of this is. So I think personally, there's so much I've learned in the last few months being a student at the college and how to apply this. I just realize on a daily basis that the more the different departments communicate to each other to see which is the important things that will need to be used going forward and how they can contribute to enhancing each other is the most important thing out of all of this. And it's almost like for everything that we do, there is something that's probably already been done in a different field where we might be benefiting from, at the very least from a conservation point of view. But in terms of reading more, the more one reads, the better. I think to get a holistic idea of what is happening within both fields. And I think I found the internet a huge source. There is a lot of these initiatives and programs that run that have a lot written about this topic. And all of that will be really, really good for more info. Like, for instance, the Food and Agricultural Organization, the Global Ecosystem Assessment, WWF, with some of the projects that they do. This Southern African Wildlife College, they have some programs running, and there's more on their website. So I think as a start is to connect through the right channels or organizations that do have projects running. And then from there, once one understands more, you can branch out more on that. And otherwise, talking to people within the industry.
Thank you so much. I know that Ashley is struggling to hear me a little bit, but I'm going to just message her and she has the last word in terms of her final comments. Thank you so much, Ashley.
I think me and Yapi have once discussed that going on the internet and Googling all these different things about these topics is like a huge wormhole. And you get into this wormhole where there's so many different directions and so many different aspects and opinions, and it's so interesting and overwhelming at the same time, but it's absolutely incredible. And I think the more that we dive into these different directions and, as Yapi said, have conversations with different people about their experiences, then we are going to learn and grow. And with us learning and growing about these topics, we are going to help or be able to help other people learn and grow. So I think talking about conservation and its role with agriculture is so vitally important, and it's been such an interesting topic for me to research. So I'm so grateful that I got this opportunity to stimulate my learning, and hopefully we can do more learning and make a difference or a change and encourage other people to want to do the same. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ashley. Thank you so much to all of my speakers this evening. I'm hoping that this is now maybe a start to other conversations that we can have around this topic. As you guys know, we do a broader kind of conversational topic once a month on this platform. And I'm hoping to also try and incorporate more business aspects as part of, us trying to transition into the LinkedIn space with these conversations. So if you have any suggestions on possible topic that you'd want to do around more strategic business, growing your business side of the agricultural setup or sector or agribusiness space, then please do suggest it. I'm very open to suggestions. And then, of course, anything else practical, hands on farming that you want us to focus on, you're more than welcome to do that. Thank you so much to all of my speakers again and the rest of the farming community. Have a good rest of the evening. Until next time, bye bye.